they're
what
shooting
I
at
will
you.
say is
But
exactly
now
what
you have,
Imam Abu
like,
Hanifa said. He said that if you feel you have enough power to overtake the government, then do it. That's by forceful means. This is Abu Hanifa's fatwa.
Okay, so, sorry, I'm going to jump in. Sorry, I'm going to jump in and connect it to this. Sorry to have jumped in, but there's something I wanted to, a question, comment I wanted to direct towards Brother Mazin, and brothers Sheikh Omar Baloch is he's welcome to comment after as well on this. Brother Mazin, have you considered that the limited method of non-violently convincing? But before I actually ask you that, I don't dispute the peaceful means in the way the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, obtained authority and became a leader of the city-state of Medina. I'm not disputing that. But my question to you, Brother Mazin, is: have you considered that the limited method of non-violently convincing the power brokers in the Muslim majority countries may not be a correct application of the Prophet's method? Because there's a difference of context. When the Prophet was appealing like non-violently to the power brokers in the Arabian Peninsula, these power brokers were non-Muslims, of which Aus and Khazraj embraced Islam and gave their allegiance to Islam. However, these power brokers currently in the Muslim world are Muslims to begin with, and they should know better. In other words, they've reneged on Islam. Also, if we are to follow this specific non-violent method of appealing to the power brokers, an accurate application of that would be appealing to non-Muslim power brokers, say in a majority non-Muslim country. And just kind of connect to what just Sheikh Omar Baloch had stated, it looks like through some of the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he has allowed, armed takeover of a government that maybe, and you admitted that all these countries are ruling by kufr. So, for example, in some of the sayings of the Prophet, he says that we don't fight them. I'm just paraphrasing the hadith here. We don't fight them unless so as long as there is established prayer among you. Also elsewhere, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, and whosoever does not judge by what Allah has revealed. Oh, sorry, this is the Quran. So the Quran tells us that whoever does not judge by what Allah has revealed, such are the kafirun. And the Prophet Muhammad said that you can challenge the authority if you see a clear kufr and you have proof of it, right, from Allah. Now, interestingly, on these hadiths, one of the scholars, Ibn Hazm, commented on these hadiths, and this is what he said. And then after this, you can both comment on that. So Ibn Hazm said that, quote, if tyranny begins to surface, even though it is small or insignificant, the Muslims should approach the leader about it and restrain him. If he accepts their counsel and yields to the guidance of the people and his peers and establishes the laws of Islam, then there is no means of removing him. But if he refuses to fulfill any of his obligations and is unrepentant, then his removal is imperative. Someone who will stand by truth should replace him. As Allah has said, help one another in al-bir and at-taqwa. He went on to say, no part of the Sharia may be abrogated. Now, this is very telling. He says, no part of the Sharia may be abrogated, but the leaders of the Muslim countries now, of so-called the 50 plus Muslim majority countries, they have abrogated the entire Sharia. So wouldn't you say that means other than specifically the non-violent method could be justified in bringing about the true Islamic system? Go ahead, Brother Mazin.
That's a really interesting topic. Actually, it's a big discussion, and it's so to address the first point, which is calling Muslims and non-Muslims and calling to Dar al-Islam. And in general, it's just important to understand that what we're What we're talking about is changing Dar al-Kufr to Dar al-Islam. And actually, now that I think of it, I'm going to address the second point that you mentioned, which is the quote of Ibn Hazm and the hadith of أَفَلَا نُنَابِذْهُمْ بِالسَّيْفِ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. And then we'll go back to the first point. So the hadith says, the best of your rulers are the ones that you love them and they love you, and you make dua for them, they make dua for you. And the worst of your rulers are the ones that you hate them and they hate you, and you curse them and they curse you. And the Sahaba said, أَفَلَا نُنَابِذْهُمْ بِالسَّيْفِ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. He said, لَا مَا أَقَامُوا فِيكُمُ الصَّلَاةِ أو مَا صَلُّوا. So there's very different variations. They said, should we not fight them with our swords, Ya Rasulullah? And he said, no, as long as they, basically the meaning of it is as long as they implement Islam. And lots of ulama have commented on this. The reason why we know that this is what's called إطلاق الجزء وإيراد الكل, which is mentioning a part of something and intending the whole, like saying تحرير رقبة, releasing the neck of a slave. You're referring to the whole slave, not just the neck. It's a figure of speech, and it's a form of visual emphasis. You imagine the thing and you see the larger picture. So he says, and the proof that this is, he says, as long as they establish Islam. And so, as long as they establish Salah. Some people have taken this in a very weak, very poor interpretation, meaning as long as they pray Salah, or as long as they allow Salah to be prayed, or some even said Jum'ah. But this is very, very wrong and very, very weak, because the proof of that is if you have a ruler, let's say the Khalifa, and he not only legalizes alcohol and murder, he obligates murder and rape and forbids marriage, and what, you can't fight him, you can't do anything, you're held hostage, you have to obey him until the end of time. So as soon as the first ruler decides to just destroy the whole ummah, but as like, no, you can pray, but you must murder a person once a day, or else we murder you, and there's nothing you can do because he lets you pray, and he prays. So it doesn't work like that. It's referring to as long as he implements Islam. And that's why you see the comment of Ibn Hazm mentioning this. As long as what he's saying is that if the ruler does not implement what he's required to implement, which is the ahkam shari'iyya, then you should remove him. Now, as far as the hadith is referring to, this is referring to the ruler, a'immatikum, right? The rulers that Islam identifies as legitimate. So this is the one of the major points of confusion among Muslims and groups in the Ummah today that are working towards the Khilafah. Many of them don't understand this differentiation between the ahkam related to when a Khilafah is standing and the ahkam related to when there is no Khilafah. So the hukum of what do you do when there is a Khalifa and there is a Khilafah and the Khalifa starts implementing other than Islam? How do you deal with that? You don't go back to the method of forming a group and trying to change public opinion and seeking nusra. What does that have? That's not how you do it. That has nothing to do with it. That has to do with, you have right now Islam. The Khilafah is up and the Khalifa is ruling with something other than Islam. So you have two scenarios. One, he's being unjust in how he implements Islam. And the second one is he's ruling with actual kufr laws. So if he's being unjust, and the Prophet ﷺ gave, like the hadith was mentioned in a way that gives contingencies for both. He's saying that if you see a ruler and there's many hadith that talk about this, but if you see a ruler and he's disobeying Allah Azza wa Jal, as long as he's implementing Islam, even if he whips your back and takes your wealth, there's another narration that mentions this, you must hear and you must obey. Meaning that if there's a Khalifa and he's very, very unjust with how he implements Islam, such as there's a law in Hukum Shari'i that if the Khalifa gives you an order and you refuse to do it, this is rebellion, it's baghi, and therefore he can punish you. Now that's an unjust Khalifa who would punish you if he said, become, like for example, become the mufti of, like become my mufti, and the alim says, I don't want to do this job and I refuse to. Then you punish him and imprison him and so on. That's being unjust. And so, but that's still implementing the hukum. He's not taking a law from kufr and applying it. He's misapplying or unjustly applying a hukum from Islam. In that case, we are obligated to obey him. You have to continue obeying the rule. This is where the whole advising the ruler in private and not going out and calling for rebellion against him that some ignorant people today try to apply on Saudiya or whoever else. That doesn't apply on these rulers today. They're not khulafa, they're not rulers that implement Islam. In a khilafah, in a state that implements Islam, these ahkam apply because there are specific and strict ahkam that apply to the rulers that Islam sees as legitimate. And this is really the key point. Islam identifies who's a legitimate ruler, and you'll never ever find Islam talking about a ruler giving rights and responsibilities to somebody who's illegitimate. One quick analogy is, actually a brother gave me this analogy, may Allah reward him, is that if you have, let's say you as a mufti or as a leader in the community, a person comes to you and says, look, I have a problem with my girlfriend. We've been living together for 10 years. We have, we live just like a marriage. We have rights, we have responsibilities. I get the money, she does this and whatever, but she won't have intimate relations with me. And so you can't say, well, the hukm of Islam on the role of a wife, and she has these rights and these. You don't start taking ahkam of a legitimate male-female relationship and try to apply it on an illegitimate male-female relationship. So you can't take the ahkam of Islam that apply to a legitimate ruler and try to apply it on an illegitimate ruler that Islam doesn't even order you to obey in the first place. So the ahkam of Islam related to rulers, any hukum, any hadith, any ayah that talks about a ruler, it's only referring to legitimate rulers, meaning the Khalifa. If you want to talk about, and then when the Sahaba said, should we not fight them with our swords? He said, no, as long as they're implementing Islam. Meaning that if they stop implementing Islam, so if you have a Khalifa and he stops implementing Islam, this is, it would be to oversimplifying it to say you rather go fight him. The correct process is that if the Khalifa starts implementing Allah, that lakum fihi min Allahi burhan, you have proof from Allah that this is kufr. You can't kufr Allah. So the Prophet has been saying it's not that you have a difference of opinion with him. It's not that you disagree with him. You have proof that this is kufr and this has nothing to do with Islam. Then you fight him. And of course, in the Shari'ah, we know that the more detailed hukum is that you first account him, and then you take him to court, which is mahkam al-madhalim, which was applied a lot throughout the history of Islam. And then if you still refuses, then you raise your swords on him and you fight him until the death. And you have to remove him. You have to go to war. You must raise your swords and you must do everything you can. But this is where the quote of Abu Hanifa comes in, and a lot of the ulama, you only do so if you can. If you're just a group of 10 people and you only have limited weapons, you can't go and fight the ruler. The only time you're allowed to rebel against the ruler and remove him if he's implementing kufr is if you're capable to do so. So that's why these ahkam are being mixed up and they're referring to something completely different.
I agree on this. His whole explanation is very beautiful. I like it.
Barakallah bik. And then, so the second point is that, okay, now if we talk about now we're asking the question, how do you establish a state from scratch? Then you go to the evidences that exist in the situation where there is no state, and how do you get there? And that's why you look at the evidence of, well, Rasulullah started as a Prophet without a state, and he worked until he had a state. And that's, of course, where we come to the question of, well, where is the defining line of a state? But that's the main thing when you talk about those things of...
but I understand when the scholars were having this discussion on when to rebel, it was in the context of the Khalifa state, and I understand there's a nuanced discussion about this. My point I'm trying to make is that today it's like a day and night difference, right? We got these leaders who are, because the scholars were talking about if they abrogate a part of it, then we can talk about, if it's validated to rebel, right, against the state. Here, it's even far worse. The Muslim leaders have abrogated the entire Sharia. So the point I'm trying to make is that in that regard, would that be an option if there's a well-organized resistance?
No, and the reason why is because there's this thing called the manat in the Shari'ah. Whenever you're trying to understand a hukum, you must understand the manat. You must understand the circumstances in which the hukum is applied. So you can't take a hukum from one thing and just extend it to any manat you want, because then all of a sudden you can take the ahkam of jihad or the ahkam of zakah and apply it in the ahkam of salah, or you can't just cross things around. So you have to understand, well, what is the context in which this was revealed, what it was revealed for, and you can't cross it into another one unless there's an evidence that allows you to cross it into it. So the ahkam related to the rulers in the context of having a khalifa is one thing, and then the question is, well, when you don't have a khalifa or a khilafa, what do you do? Now, do you raise weapons against the ruler? Well, the hadith about the rulers is referring to legitimate rulers. All of them, if you look at every single one of them, but
Brother Mazin, isn't it a given for a Muslim leader of a Muslim majority area to be ruling with Islam anyways?
No, that's
it's not a given?
Yeah. No, it's a given. No, but let me just interject, Brother Mazin. So it's given, as a Muslim, you should be obviously implementing Sharia, but the reality is different. So what we're trying to say here is that, okay, there's ahkam, you have to basically raise your sword against a khalifa. But if there's no khalifa, there's no khalifa state present, then you cannot take the ahkam to actually go raise a sword against a khalifa against the current the political structure of the Muslim majority countries. So
I want to add here, there are some ahadith that are in the very general form. Man ra'a minkum munkaran falyughayyiru bihi yadihi. Whoever sees something wrong, let him change it with his hands. فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ بِلِسَانِهِ فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ بِقَلْبِهِ وَذَلِكَ أَضْعَفُ الْإِيمَانِ. And so even in the general sense, I think that, you know, trying to say that we are basically, you're going to have to decide, are we in the Makki phase or are we in some other phase? Like, are we? So that's what you're going to have to decide. Are we in the Makki phase? Okay, if we're in the Makki phase, then we're following the Makki pattern. I mean, a certain procedure, right?
Yeah.
If we're not in the Makki phase, then you have to define. Okay, we're not in the Makki.
Well, you know, like this goes to my comment towards Brother Mazin on the misapplication as well, which I will let Brother Mazin respond to me on that. But it depends on the context, right? So, for example, for Muslims in a non-Muslim majority country, it would be the muckin phase. That would be almost identical to the muckin phase. For Muslims in a Muslim majority country, where the Muslim leader is not implementing with Sharia, that's a totally different phase. It's not the muckin phase. Anyways, go ahead, Brother Mazin, go ahead. Yeah.
So just to clarify a couple of things. First of all, in order to understand, so that's why whenever you're like really at the baseline of it, when you're trying to perform ijtihad on something, you have to know the question you're asking first. The question is what defines the ijtihad. So when you talk about under a khilafah and the ruler starts implementing other than Islam or is unjust, the question then becomes, in the first case of an unjust ruler, how do I rectify an unjust ruler? And then you look at the hukam. So you have to ask, like, what question am I asking Allah Azza wa Jal? Ya oh Allah, how do I correct an unjust ruler who implements Islam? Second question is, oh Allah, how do I correct a khalifa who's starting to implement other than Islam? Or a khalifa who's been implementing other than Islam for a while? How do I deal with that? And the third question is, oh Allah, how do I, and that's today, how do I reestablish the khilafah? Because the problem is that if you go and rectify a ruler and you don't have a khalifa, or a khilafah, sorry, it's nonsense. You go, okay, I go and correct Erdogan. He's a nice guy. I go and he starts implementing Islam. Until what? Oh, okay, so the actual question is, how do I get to a khilafah? It doesn't matter about correcting him. I'm not correcting one thing or two things or 10 things. I'm correcting the entire system. I'm no longer correcting the ruler. The whole system doesn't exist.
Okay, so Brother Mazin, I'm going to jump in because you've kind of ignited a very, very pressing topic here, and which is totally relevant, right, in our today's time. You know what? The scholars of Hizb ut-Tahrir, I would say they have done the only work in terms of articulating and giving a picture of what the Islamic system looks like, in terms of drafting what the systems of Islam would look like. Amazing job. Now, let me give you a hypothetical scenario, okay? You got leaders of certain groups, and so only about a handful or less than a handful of groups calling for khilafah. They come together, they approach a leader like Erdogan, say, listen, you know, as a Muslim, a leader of a Muslim majority state, it is obligation of you to implement khilafah. We got the draft systems all in place, here it is, you're ready to implement. He says, screw you, go back. You come back. Now you have to decide what to do. He has
you
denied.
Come to Sheikh Omar then.
He is rejected. He's rejected to rule by Islam, and he wants to continue to rule by kufr. Now, based on the Sunnah and what the Prophet says, it looks like the Prophet has given leeway. Now we'll have to look at an organized way of resisting and taking over the government and having a new military to establish the Islamic State. What is your response to that, Brother Mazin?
If you look at the context of all the hadith, they all refer to fighting the ruler and not the entire system.
Well, I'm not talking about fighting the entire system, but obviously there's a few that have power, right? Obviously, you'll have to confront them.
True, and what I'm saying though is that when you, as I said, what you're looking at is the question of accounting and fighting the ruler versus establishing an entire system. The problem is that the Prophet ﷺ, when he was in Mecca, he was in a position of not having a system. So trying to fight the ruler or account the ruler is of no use, because the problem is the system. So when you address the society, you address the society,
but
rulers,
but
and
brother
military.
Mazin, there's a difference. There's a difference. In Makkah, it's a majority non-Muslim area.
Yeah.
So that goes to my other question. Earlier on, I had that. I believe there's a misapplication. If you're limiting yourself to only peaceful means in the Muslim world, it is a misapplication because the contexts are not the same.
So
Because
the reason why the context is the same is because if you need to understand how to define what you're trying to change, and so this is the basis of it. What the Prophet ﷺ was doing from the Meccan period into the Medinan period was trying to change a Dar al-Kufr into a Dar al-Islam. And the Dar is defined not by the people in the land, rather it's defined by the laws that are applied on the land. And this is known by the hadith of Sariyat, I think it was Usama bin Zayd. The Prophet ﷺ, he sends them out and he tells them, when you come to a new land, it's a long hadith, he says, call them to Islam. فَإِنْ أَجَابُوكَ فَقْبَلْ مِنْهُمْ وَكُفَّ عَنْهُم. So if they accept Islam, then don't fight them. ثم ادعهم إلى التحول من دارهم إلى دار المسلمين أو دار المهاجرين. And so he says, and then if they accept Islam, so this is the key, if the people of that land accept Islam, accept that from them and don't fight them, then call them to switching from their dar to the dar of the Muslims or the dar of the muhajirin. Which means that it doesn't matter if they're all Muslims or if they're all kuffar. That doesn't change anything. You have to ask them to switch their land and basically come under the authority of the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims, and to become part of Dar al-Muhajirin, Dar al-Muslimin. ثم أخبرهم أنهم إن فعلوا ذلك فلهم ما للمهاجرين أو المسلمين وما على المهاجرين أو المسلمين. So, and tell them that if they were to do so, then they would have all the rights and all the responsibilities of the believers. And if they don't, then they would be treated like Arab, like foreigners, and the ahkam would still apply to them, but they would not have basically anything from the wealth of the state and so on. And like I said, the hadith is long.
Yeah, but in that regard, that's thanks for sharing that. But in that regard, then they will be liable. They will be liable to be, say, to be fixed, right? To be liberated by the Muslims to implement Islam.
I think we are mixing here like two different things. I think kind of going back to it, the context is very important.
If you don't mind, let me change the context a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
Let's say the Muslim population, forget about any population. Let's say they want to have less taxes. Okay, a country wants to have less taxes. Let's say the taxes are 80%, and they want to have taxes less than that, 20%, 10%. Right? Because social change is social change. Okay? And social change has to do with the sunnahs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيْرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيْرُ مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. Allah doesn't change the people until they change themselves. And there have been many examples in history of social change. Whether it was French Revolution, whether it was the Russian Revolution, whether it was the revolution of the Prophet, whether, so all these different social changes, they all matter. They all have it because Allah allowed that change to occur, right? So while the seerah is a guiding principle in terms of specifics, but social change in general can be allowed by any means that social change is done. Meaning social change occurs in when you study social change in any environment, in any like, for example, let's take the US, for example. The social change that's occurred here when it comes to gays and lesbians, they took certain steps, right? Certain procedures that changed the whole culture to accept something that wasn't there. So the point is, you will find those steps in the seerah of the Prophet. They may be less steps than the Prophet took, but some basic things will be there, always, in the seerah of the Prophet. Then you can also, so you have the seerah of the Prophet, you can compare the seerah of the Prophet to other social changes, okay? Because Allah is the one that allows social change to happen. As a general principle within Quran, meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that does it. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does it based upon His sunnah. So studying all social changes, you can benefit from them. There's no question about that. The seerah is your guiding principle. Then also, in addition to that, understanding how the Prophet's social change is more comprehensive than let's say, the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution. Also in this context, how the Prophet's revolution is more complete than, let's say, the revolution done by Musa alayhi salatu or the change that Isa alayhi salatu wanted. Because, for example, Musa had hijrah, but he had no tarbiyah before hijrah, for example. So you can look at these things, and there is some general principles of, it could be any X issue, right? You can say, let's say it's about taxes. You can still say, okay, well, let's approach the military. Okay, that's a good way. Let's have a social agitation and how to bring about that change. I think that we have to understand that a lot of what we're talking about is not necessarily fixed. A lot of what we're talking about is within the realm of mubah or jaiz, number one. And a lot of it is just allowed, meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't say don't do something, which means that it's allowed. Okay, especially in the issues of mu'amalat. Okay, so if something is not prohibited, like for example, let's say somebody says, I want to bring the Islamic State by writing books. Well, it's not going to work. We agree upon that, but it's not haram. It's not haram for him to write books, convincing people to write books and say that this is the specific methodology this person's going to take. Yeah, Marx wrote Das Kapital, and that changed the world. It could happen. It is possible for somebody. Imam Ghazali wrote his book, Tahafut al-Falasifa, changed the Muslim world. You know, so it is, you have, in terms of adapting means for social change, right? You could generally look at any process of social change and how successful it's been. But then now you're looking also, especially for khilafah, bringing the khilafah, you're also looking in, because who was a better social reformer than Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? So we're also looking at his seerah. Now, you will extract that aspect that is common between the Quran and the seerah. First, that you will take that as your guiding principles. Then you're going to have to weigh between what the Prophet did in his time versus the social changes, how they occur in your time. And you're going to have to balance that out.
Mm-hmm. No, actually, I would I just want to add a couple more points, and then I would actually want Brother Mazin to answer Zishan's point, and then kind of refer back to you, Sheikh Omar. So, I mean, I think what I was trying to say was the context obviously is very different. As an example, if I may extend an analogy, that to actually choose a khalifa, you have 3 days, right? Shari'ah obligation is 3 days. You have to choose a khalifa within 3 days. But since 1924, we don't have a khalifa. So now when the khalifa comes into existence, or the khilafah state comes into existence, we're not going to go back to the shura, right? And actually, give them 3 days, because it has to get implemented, -1, right? And so you can't say that, well, okay, you want to actually, have a khilafah state, but no, we have to go through the shura process to actually elect a khalifa. That rule would not apply in today's context, right? That would only apply if you already have an existing khilafah state. Then you can actually go and refer to that injunction and basically, try to create a case that, oh, you know what, you can't just, choose whatever you want. You have to have a consultation, the shura, and the whole 9 yards. And that's the process we have to follow. So I think, Zishan, kind of answering, to your question, adding on to what Brother Mazin had said before, that yes, if we had the khilafah and the khalifa was basically, not implementing Islam, then obviously I think, whatever you've said, it completely applies. But if we don't have the whole system in place, let it be, 99% Muslim majority country, as in Pakistan as an example, right? And the rulers being Muslims, that's completely different, or in contrast to to having a khilafah state with even actually 10 Muslims and maybe 20,000 non-Muslims. Let's say the whole khilafah state has 29,000 population, and out of that you only have 1,000 Muslims and 28,000 non-Muslims. That would still apply. Whereas if you just completely go opposite, it would not apply, because you don't have the structure in place to actually apply that ahkam. Brother Mazin, I will let you.
Brother Ali, what makes up society, right? It makes society is made up of people and their thoughts and their views and where they stand, right?
Right.
So society is reflective of what people's ideas are, right? So what essentially you're saying is that we have to treat the Muslim majority countries as they're all, or more or less, generally they're kafirs, and that's how we can apply. And then the application becomes identical to the
no. So what I'm saying is I completely agree with you. What I'm saying is that society as a whole, which is basically obviously based on the ideas and the thoughts, but it's also made up of systems and social structures as well. That's kufr. Society as a whole is kufr. It's deserving of the Azhar, right? But individually, we are all Muslims.
No, over
So
here, I also want to add, brother, just to make a clarification. We are legally Muslims because we have professed it with our mouths.
Right.
But Iman has not entered our hearts, which is the difference. When people accepted Islam in Mecca, for example, they didn't only protest it with their lips. It wasn't just lip service. They also believed it in their hearts. Today, all of the mind, the makeup, the mental makeup is all foreign. But your culture is Islam. Part of your culture is Islam.